Thank you all for joining. We will start at the top of the hour. Welcome to the latest online learning session, Forest of Faucets, the role of private forest landowners in maintaining water quality. I'm Scott Jones, the Director of Forest Landowners Association, and we're also joined today by Lauren O'Shea Ward, who is the President of the Forest Landowners Foundation. And we're happy to have you all here with us today or watching later online. A few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, we will address those at the end of the presentation. Just go ahead and post those in the Q&A or the chat. Either one, we'll be monitoring those and presenting those to Ryan at the end of his presentation. So August is National Water Quality Month, and the Forest Landowners Association is well aware of the vital role private forest landowners play in creating clean water. Joining us today is Ryan Toot, watershed forester with the U.S. Forest Service. And I want to give you a little bit of background about Ryan. He has an undergraduate degree in geological engineering and water resources and a master's degree in forest ecology, both from the University of Minnesota. His work experience in the private sector, engineering, in the public sector, and forest management. He's been the Midwest watershed forester and with state, private, and tribal forestry of the USDA Forest Service for over 5 years, and has been the Forest to Faucets program lead for state, private, and tribal forests for almost a year. So we're really happy to have Ryan here with us, not only to talk to us about what Forest to Faucets is, but this should be a tool we all use as private forest landowners to talk about the importance of forest in creating both water quality and quantity. So I really encourage you, after you view this webinar, participate today. We'll be sending this out in an email to all the participants afterwards, also archiving on our website. Send this to somebody you know, another association you may be a part of. If you're a member of your state forestry association, share that with your state forestry association. This is really good information, and it's really important that we're all knowledgeable about how to talk about the important role forests play in providing clean water and good water quality. So Ryan, we're excited to have you here today. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm really excited to be able to spend some time with you today and chat about the importance of forests to water quality. And I have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to dive right in. A little overview of the talk that we're gonna go through today. I'm gonna give a little bit of background about the importance of private lands to water quality. So this will be a little background information, kind of what Scott was talking about. How we can talk about the importance of forest to water, and how important family forest land is to water quality. Then I'm going to spend a good chunk of time discussing the forest to faucets analysis. And then finally, I'll end with some information on how individual landowners can be managing their forest lands with water quality in mind. And at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions. So feel free to kind of drop those in the chat as we go along, and that'll be monitored. There's about 766 million acres of forest land in the United States. That's about 1/3 of our land base. And that's down a little bit from 1630, where forest land covered about 46% of the total land area. And private land ownership is an important piece of that forest ownership. It's about 60% of our nation's forest land. And you can see in part from the slide here that a lot of that private forest land ownership is concentrated in the eastern US. And when you dive a little deeper, thinking about family forest land, those landowners that are owning more than 10 acres and it's not corporate ownership, that ownership accounts for about 39% of our nation's forest land. Management of these important private lands is in all the private landowners' hands. And the Forest Service is interested in helping those private landowners manage those forest lands sustainably, because the communities rely on those forests for all the benefits that forests provide. We all benefit from even those private lands, and the Forest Service, of course, recognizes that. So this slide, this graphic does kind of a nice job of walking through all the ways that we can benefit from our forested lands. Many of these, I'd say 5 out of 6 at least, are connected to water. But I'm going to really just focus on the ones that are specifically water in this graphic. And I'll cover first this slow the flow. So forests on the landscape, trees on the landscape intercept rainwater. They catch it in their canopies, allowing some of that rainwater to evaporate and not even ever touch the forest floor. And they also utilize water that does infiltrate into the soil through their roots. They transpire it. And so some of the rain that falls on the landscape doesn't even get to the surface water. The water that does make its way to the surface water is slowed through all the organic matter that forests deposit on the forest floor, and reaches those streams and the water bodies more slowly. And this reduces the velocity that water is moving across the landscape, and it helps hold that soil in place. Obviously, the roots of the trees and other vegetation on the landscape are helping hold that soil in place as well. Ultimately, this mechanism of slowing the flow on the landscape reduces downstream flood peaks and the total amount of water that is moving downstream, and so reduces downstream flooding. In addition, all that soil that is held on the landscape by our forests helps ensure that water entering our waterways is clean. Soil oftentimes brings with it some nutrients and other pollutants, and so maintaining that soil on the landscape is obviously important to keep those nutrients in the terrestrial ecosystems, to keep them available to plants there, but also to reduce nutrients in our water and eutrophication, all the pollution that occurs with excess nutrients. The other thing that happens when we hold that water on the landscape with our forests is that water is allowed to trickle down and recharge our groundwater. Groundwater is an important source of water for many of our communities in our agriculture, and so it's really important that we're recharging those aquifers through our forests. So all these things kind of come together and help maintain clean water, both in our groundwater and our surface water. And it's actually been found that for every 10% increase in forest cover up to about 70% of the landscape, water treatment costs decrease by 20%. So we see this effect in our water treatment costs sort of at the landscape level. And it's really important that we maintain forests on our landscape for water quality. And one other thing I want to mention here too is the shade that trees provide for our streams. This provides really important habitat for many aquatic species, including fish that require cold water to survive. That's another important benefit to our waterways. Family forests conserve about 14 million acres that border our waterways. That's land that's really directly adjacent to water in riparian areas. And obviously these, important places are kind of a nexus of forest and water. And so they're really important to be thinking about when we're thinking about forests and water. But we also want to think about forests sort of in a landscape or on a watershed context. Our forests they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist alongside other land uses. And for folks that aren't familiar, a watershed really describes an area of land that drains all of its surface water to a single water body. And what happens in those watersheds really determines the water quality in that water body that all the water is draining into. So in your home, you have a faucet, most likely, and you have drinking water coming out of that faucet. Comes out of the faucet, but it does not originate at the faucet. It finds its way there through the surface of the land. It comes down as rainwater. It filters through whatever land use is there. It might be forest or agriculture or developed land. It makes its way into groundwater, or it makes its way into surface water. It might get pumped through a well, or it might go through a water treatment process before it comes out in your faucet. And it's important to consider all of that is happening on the watershed before it comes through your faucet and you're able to drink it. If that land cover is forest, you're probably in pretty good shape. It's probably pretty good water quality. If it's agricultural, developed land, if it's dominated by those things, that water quality is likely diminished. So that landscape context is really important, but forest or natural land cover really is the best land use for water quality. And drinking water really is about as tangible as you can get when it comes to community benefits from our forests. We all need clean water to drink, and there's no exceptions to that. And so it's obviously an object of some study. Researchers at the Forest Service and staff from state, private, and tribal forestry staff collaborated to put together a tool that reports on where surface water is used for drinking water, where our land and our forests can supply clean surface water for drinking, and where threats to our forests are threats to our nation's drinking water. So this is the Forest to Faucets 2.0 analysis. And the next slides are going to walk through that analysis, but I want to make a couple points kind of right away. And the first is that Forest to Faucets looks at surface drinking water only. It doesn't consider groundwater that is used for drinking. The relationship between forests and groundwater is a little bit more complex, and there's many different data sets involved. And so that's sort of another beast, and it's not considered in Forest to Faucets. And second, this analysis is meant for a landscape level analysis, not a parcel level analysis. So it's more for large scale planning, but it is useful to see areas on the landscape that are important for surface drinking water and where forests are important to that water. And the scale that we presented at is a Huck 12 watershed scale, which is on average about 36 square miles. So that's how all this information is presented. So what we're going to talk about today is Forest to Faucets 2.0, which we released in about 2020, so about 4 years ago. And this is a collaboration between, again, Forest Service research and state, private, and tribal forestry staff, but we included 30 advisors from other federal agencies, state agencies, academia, industry, and nonprofit organizations. 2.0 came about because many of the data sets that feed Forest to Faucets were updated, and because we wanted to include climate change as one of the threats that was considered with the Forest to Faucets analysis. Forest to Faucets 2.0 is really made up of essentially 3 models, and we'll walk through each of those together. The first model is important watersheds for surface drinking water consumers. This model really looks at all the Huck 12 sub-watersheds across the US and identifies those that are important to surface drinking water. The data that we used to understand whether these watersheds are important to surface drinking water come from the EPA Safe Drinking Water Information System, which identifies all the surface drinking water intakes in the US and attributes populations served to each of those intakes. So you can imagine that watersheds upstream of an intake are important to the population that is utilizing that intake. We also incorporated a function to incorporate the idea that the further upstream you go from that intake, the less important that watershed is. That water is, of course, diluted as it comes down. And so the watersheds that are far upstream make up a smaller component of the water serving that intake and are therefore less important. We also utilized mean annual water supply for each watershed, so the amount of water that is coming out of each watershed to get at this important watersheds for surface drinking water. So this is what that model looks like for the US. You can see the equation there on the left that I just described, and on the right-hand side, you can see this map. The blue areas have a high value for important watersheds to surface drinking water. And the yellow is a lower value. These are all numbers 1 to 100. It's an index, so each watershed is essentially ranked against all of the other sheds, all of the other subwatersheds across the U.S. It's a decimal. There are more than 100 watersheds in the U.S., of course, but it's a number from 1 to 100 that sort of compares it to other watersheds. The second model that's part of Forest to Faucets assesses subwatersheds across the US to identify those with an existing ability to produce clean water based on its current biophysical characteristics. So this is really looking at what the land cover is across the US and attributing land cover that is natural, forest, shrub, or grassland to a high ability to produce clean water. Percent impervious or agricultural land sort of counts against that ability, and riparian natural cover, that cover that would be next to our water bodies, if that is forested, that's another consideration that we made here. And finally, we again used mean annual water supply, so water that is coming out of these watersheds to identify, those watersheds that have a high ability to produce clean water. So I mentioned riparian areas, and I want to take a little sidestep here to look at how we addressed riparian areas. To understand where riparian areas are on the landscape, we used a model that the US Forest Service developed with the US Geological Survey to map riparian areas based on soils, topography, and hydrology data. And so this is a variable width riparian area. It's not simply a 10-meter buffer applied to every stream or lake, but it's much more sophisticated than that. And you can actually explore that data set as well if you're interested. This is a really cool data set that helps us define riparian areas across the whole US. So this is what ability to produce clean water looks like across the US. And I want to point out here that you can see the middle part of the country has a lower, generally has a lower ability to produce clean water. And that's for a couple of reasons. Recall that some of the inputs to this model are both the amount of water flowing out of these watersheds, but also natural cover. So the central part of our country has some more arid regions, but also has a lot more cropland, more agricultural land. And so that is why we see that sort of middle part of the country with a lower ability here. Recall that this is also an index. And so if somebody is interested in sort of addressing a smaller area, not the entire US, but say, for instance, I'm sitting in Minnesota. So say I'm interested in looking at Minnesota specifically, I could recalculate that index and sort of pull out the details in Minnesota, highlighting some of the areas in Minnesota that are particularly important and contrasting them from other areas. So I just want to make that point because, it looks like a large part of the central part of the country may be less important, but there are still differences and you can draw that further out from the data. And if you're interested in that, reach out and we'd be happy to help you do that. The final model, which is actually made up of 4 different models, is threats to important watersheds. So I mentioned we wanted to look at climate change, and climate change is integrated in some of these threats. We looked at 4 different risks to our forests that impact their ability to provide clean water. We looked at insect and disease risk. We looked at land use change potential. We looked at wildfire potential, and we looked at water yield change potential. So and we'll get to the final one when we get there, and we'll walk through each of these. First, wildfire hazard potential. We incorporated a model that came from a US fire lab, or a US Forest Service fire lab in Fort Collins. And we looked at where there was high and very high wildfire potential, and combined that with the relative important watersheds and the ability to provide clean water, those 2 models that I just talked about. We combined all of those things to achieve this final index. Again, a number from 1 to 100, looking at where high fire risk, an ability to provide clean water, and an important watershed combined to have this high wildfire threat to our surface drinking water. For insect and disease risk, we used the National Insect and Disease Risk Forest Maps, which looks at risk that at least 25% of standing live basal area greater than 1 inch in diameter will die over a 15-year time frame. And that 15-year time frame was actually 2013 to 2027. And that's due solely to insects and diseases. This is a really complex model that accounts for, all the known insects and diseases out there, their ranges, things about their climate, their climate needs or climate restrictions for those insects and diseases, their forest types that they impact. All this information is put together. So we use this model in conjunction with importance to surface drinking water to achieve that final index that you see on the screen now. To look at future land use change, we used EPA data, a model called the Integrated Climate and Land Use Scenario Model. And we identified watersheds or subwatersheds that, and we calculated the percent of land use change for each subwatershed and multiplied that by the relative importance to surface drinking water to achieve a final index. So watersheds that look like they are going to be converting to developed uses, that is a higher risk. And for this scenario, we actually have multiple carbon emission scenarios and also different date ranges. So you can see we have low or high emissions for mid-century, so 2040, and also low and high emissions for 2090. So there's sort of subsets of models within here that folks can explore and look at. And finally, we looked at a future decrease in water yield, again, for 2040 and 2090. Water yield, again, is the amount of water that is coming off of these watersheds. So where watersheds look like they're going to be drier based on climate change and what we know about climate change, these are areas that are at higher risk in this map and kind of light up red. We combine that information, again, with the importance to surface drinking water to achieve this final index. And we, similarly to the last risk, we have different emission scenarios, different carbon emission scenarios, low or high, and we have different date ranges, year ranges that you can look at and explore. So I described all the models, and it's a lot that are incorporated in Forest to Faucets. And the way that we present this is through an online tool called a story map. Now, this story map has different components here, and you can see at the top, hopefully you can see my cursor, but at the top you have different tabs. And the first tab is an About tab, and this walks through some of the different tools that are available with these Forest to Faucets tools. And so it's an important first stop to start exploring this data. I've sort of walked through the models now, and I'll walk through the different tools that we have to explore those. So this first tab, this About tab, will help get you oriented. And the next tab up here, the Data Explorer tab, is where you can begin to look at the data. I've shown you some of the screenshots of the data. Hopefully you're kind of interested now, and you'll be able to dive into this Data Explorer and look at some of this data for yourself. The first thing that happens when you click on this tab is you get a splash page that walks you through what some of the boxes that you're looking at are, kind of helps orient you to this tool. And we'll do that together here fairly briefly. On the left-hand side, we have a set of filters so that you can look at specific watersheds based on your interests. Maybe you want to look only at watersheds that have a high ability to produce clean water. Well, you can do that with this filtering tool. And you can see on screen for Michigan, I'm looking only at watersheds that have an importance value between 60 and 100. So those are relatively important watersheds for surface drinking water. The map obviously is shown in the center here, and there's a few different things you can do with that. First, I want to make clear that you can click up here to show the index values. Again, remember, darker blue is higher importance, but you can display that legend through this map. You can also click up here on the upper left to be able to draw a box around watersheds that you're interested in, or you can click on watersheds that you're interested in. On the right-hand side here, you have a summary and additional information about the watersheds that are shown on screen. And the default way this comes up is it summarizes all the information for all the watersheds you see. As soon as you select the watershed, what appears in this box is specific to that watershed or those watersheds that you've selected. So you get some general information on this first page, and you can print a report, a PDF report, or export data. And I'll take you through what those reports look like shortly. But you can see at the bottom right here, there are a bunch of other tabs, and we'll take a look at what those provide in terms of information. So here I have one watershed selected, and this first tab down here describes details about that watershed. It has a really high importance to surface drinking water, 99 on that index. And it has a moderate or medium ability to provide clean water, 53 of 100. And then it provides information about your surface water intakes, how many people those intakes serve, how many are in that watershed, and how many folks that watershed serves downstream. It also tells you how many groundwater intakes there are. And it gives you information about forest ownership, which again isn't neither groundwater nor forest ownership are really a part of the forest to faucets models, but they are presented. This information is presented through these tools. And then you see watershed characteristics at the bottom there. I'm going to jump over water use, but that's available as well. You can also get straight to the EPA information, the Safe Drinking Water Information System, through this public water supply tab. So if you're interested in a certain public water supply, or you want to know who these are serving, you want to know more information about those intakes, you can actually click on these. These are all links, and you can go right to that EPA database. Just as a sidebar, the specific location of those intakes is sensitive data, so we don't display that, and you won't be able to find that on the EPA website. Finally, the last tab is potential threats. So obviously, there was 4 potential threats models, and those are all represented here. You can see we represent the high emissions and the full century scale. That's the indexes we present for water yield and land use. But you can see all those threat models in those tabs. If you want to get a little bit more detailed in your reporting or your analysis of the landscape, you can use this reports tool. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Again, it has a splash page that sort of walks through some of that information for you. And there's a user guide that I'll show you briefly too at the end. But I do want to show you what a report looks like. Remember, you can get to a report from that Data Explorer tab or from the reporting tab. And this is an example of one of the automatically generated PDF reports for that same watershed I had selected. And we kind of walk through all that information. So it prints out all this information for you in a nice format that you can, hand out at a meeting or use as a handout for a presentation if you're interested in a particular watershed. So it's a very handy tool. Other things you can do with this tool include identifying watersheds that are downstream of a selected watershed, or identifying watersheds that are upstream of a selected watershed. So these are all pretty cool tools that folks that want to really dive deeper into this information can use. So the next tab up at the top here is the methods tab, and this really walks through all the information that I've sort of already covered today. It covers it in a little bit more detail, and it offers a link to the official Forest Service report with this information. And finally, we have a user guide tab that has videos. Rebecca does a fantastic job of walking folks through how to explore this data in different ways, things that we did not have time to do today. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath. We've gone through the forest to faucets analysis, and I know it was a lot, but hopefully got you thinking, got you a little bit excited about ways that you can kind of look at the data and explore your watershed and the landscape context for your forest land. I want to make mention that forest to faucets is being used in many places. And one of the ways that it's used is to inform partnerships that are really working on this relationship between forest and water. They're helping manage private lands for water quality. And these are all examples from the Eastern US, and the Forest Service is engaged and involved in all these. And the forest to faucets data helps kind of drive some of this work. This is all there in many different locations. Work like this is happening, and forest to faucets is really exciting. The Forest Service is excited to be able to serve these partnerships and engage in these partnerships with funding and technical information. Okay, so now we're going to dive into managing your own private forest land with water in mind. Well, the good news is that maintaining that forest on the landscape is really the best thing that you can do. And the way to maintain forest on a landscape is really through planning. So what I would pitch is that it's important to get a professional forester and have a plan written for your woods, working with the forester to understand, the trajectory that your woods is on, working with a forester if you plan to harvest timber. This can help ensure that you're going to meet your goals for your land, and also follow sound silvicultural principles. A forester in your area will understand sort of the site-specific implications of your land, what kind of forest your land can support, and really help you meet those goals and help you maintain a resilient forest. Because in order to maintain forests in the long run, our forests have to be resilient to threats. And those threats come in a number of different forms, but insects and disease, wildfire are important threats to be considering. Climate change is an important threat to be considering as well. And so a forester will kind of will be able to help you walk through all of those things. Some things that a forester might recommend, specific tactics for are increasing species and structural diversity. This helps maintain resiliency in forests. Maybe you need to restore fire in fire-dependent ecosystems, such as oak woodlands. This helps these ecosystems be more resilient. And you might address specific threats, whether it's oak wilt or emerald ash borer in your forest. You might need to do invasive species management to help your forest be more resilient and maintain that forest canopy in the long run. Another important consideration is that long run. So what happens after you move on? If it's family forest land, doing estate planning is extremely important to helping maintain that forest landscape and maintain that legacy of forest on the landscape. I talked a little bit about riparian areas being especially important as they are adjacent to our waterways. And so these are areas to pay some special focus if you're really interested in water quality. Managing invasive species in these areas can be an important tool. You see a fair amount of disturbance with flooding and also through other disturbances. These waterways can actually serve as a propagule or a seed source for invasive species to take root in freshly disturbed areas. So managing invasive species in riparian areas can be really important to maintaining forest in the long run. You might need to plant trees in these locations. If they've been impacted by flooding and haven't been able to regenerate and really should be supporting trees, you might need to plant trees in these areas. You might need to mitigate recreation impacts. People are drawn to water, and many folks have, residential buildings or trails that go down to a stream. You want to make sure that you're managing or maintaining as much native vegetation along the stream banks and in the riparian areas as possible, and controlling erosion around any recreation or other development in these areas. And as you do forest management in your uplands or your lowlands, you want to make sure that you're following best management practices in riparian areas and in other areas. And obviously in riparian areas, treading lightly is a good summation of what BMPs indicate for our riparian areas. It doesn't mean that management is not important, though, because we need these riparian areas to be resilient as well. And there are many options for management in riparian areas. So I mentioned best management practices, and I want to run through best management practices kind of generally and fairly quickly. Each state has best management practices to protect soil and water. These are really important to doing so. And if you aren't familiar with your BMPs, I urge you to get familiar with them. I'll drop a link to a website where you can find your, yes, thank you, Michelle. You dropped the link in the chat for me. That's a great site, and you can go and explore your own BMPs. Foresters are well aware of these, and loggers should be as well. BMPs are, they range from voluntary to regulatory, depending on what state you're in. But certified forest land, any wood that is going to certified mills, those should all be following best management practices. And really, following BMPs is essentially synonymous with modern silviculture at this point. Across the US, BMPs are implemented at a rate of 92%. For all timber sales, this is based on state data, and across all land ownerships, I should say. And we see that best management practices are largely quite effective at managing water quality impacts from forestry operations. Best management practices cover a range of things that you can see on the screen. I'm not going to walk through each of them, but they're all really important. Stream crossings and riparian management zones, anywhere that's sort of adjacent to water, are particular points to be very thoughtful of. Stream crossings in particular can be sources of sediment to our waterways, and it's important that we're doing all we can to maintain that soil on the landscape and prevent it from getting into our waterways. Essentially, though, the message is that meeting other management goals is, really compatible with managing forests for water. These goals fit together, whether it's you want to have sustained economic output from your forests, whether you want to have recreation or you want to manage for wildlife or birds, all these things are really compatible. And water can just be one of the goals that you're thinking of when you're thinking about managing your forests. And I think, again, I want to drive home that we all benefit from the forests that are on the landscape, including those private forests. The Forest Service, again, recognizes this, and we help private landowners sustainably manage their land through a number of programs that are essentially outlined in the Farm Bill. And these all come through the Cooperative Forestry Act assistance programs under the umbrella of landowner assistance. The flagship programs that are related to sort of rural forestry that are funded right now are Forest Stewardship Program, which we run through states. And this provides both technical assistance and education to private landowners through states, and the Landscape Scale Restoration Grant Program. States or nonprofits or tribes can apply for this grant program. That allows folks to do work on the ground on private lands or state lands, other publicly owned lands other than federal lands. And so that's actually open right now. So states, nonprofits, tribes, other organizations can apply for that. And it's for on the ground work as well as education outreach, but on the ground work is emphasized and an important component of all those projects. And we also periodically have other programs that are available. There's too many to list in this short presentation. But one I do want to mention is the temporary skidder bridge program that we offer to states and tribes. This is funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And this provides funding for states and tribes to purchase temporary skidder bridges and mats to use for rental programs. So these temporary bridges and mats can be used by loggers on private lands or state lands, other lands. And this helps folks both access areas where maybe there isn't permanent infrastructure, but it also helps folks do that in a way that doesn't put more permanent infrastructure on the landscape. Obviously, permanent infrastructure takes a lot to maintain and has some more risk to water quality. So if you can use a temporary bridge instead of putting in a permanent bridge, that risk to the water body is more temporary. And so this is a really exciting program that has funding right now through that bipartisan infrastructure law. And that is all that I have for my presentation. I have links here that all, oh, and thanks again, Michelle, for dropping those in the chat. I appreciate it. And with that, I think we can open it up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was a great overview. And I think it will really resonate with some of the folks who are listening today or later with the recording. We do have a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A, and I'll remind our attendees that you can enter a question or a comment in the Q&A. You can just hit the Q&A button, or feel free to use the chat as well. So the first question is, and you touched on this a little bit, but I think we could go a little deeper here. Do you feel like current state BMPs do a good job of protecting watersheds?
Yeah, so I think the way that I would answer is this, state BMPs, those are really state-led programs and they're dynamic programs. So I do think that, states are continuing to think about how we can improve BMPs. And it's really, being effective at mitigating impacts, but also allowing forestry to occur on the landscape, because forestry is really important, again, to maintaining forests on the landscape. We need to be deriving economic benefits. We need to be deriving other benefits for that to occur. So it's a balancing act, and each state is doing that. And what we've found, what the literature finds, is that largely BMPs are effective at mitigating impacts to water quality.
No, that's great. Thank you. The next question is, will excess water removal from aquifers, as is occurring in Southeast Georgia, for example, will that affect surface water, wetlands, and riparian areas? What is the relationship there?
Yeah, so it's very complicated, but it certainly can. And so what you can see, when there's obviously areas where groundwater and surface water interact. And so when those interactions are occurring, you might see, for instance, like a decrease in base flow. So low water flows in streams might decrease or vanish entirely if, historically that has relied on that groundwater interaction. You might see decrease in lake levels. That's actually happening in metro areas here around Minneapolis, St. Paul, where lake levels in one of our lakes is dropping because of that groundwater interaction and groundwater pumping.
Excellent. And I have a question myself too. I loved the part of the presentation where you were talking about how, the Forest to Faucets tool really has become something that helps inform partnerships and gets a lot of organizations working together toward a common goal. And when we're talking about forest landowners and trying to keep them economically viable so that they can continue practicing sustainable management practices on the ground, there's a lot of talk around payments for ecosystem services, right? And so I'm interested, has anyone sort of used the Forest to Faucets tool as a way to assess the possibility of some kind of program where forest landowners might receive compensation or some benefit for the role that their forests are playing in reducing those real costs to, water treatment in their communities and in these watersheds?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, Forest to Faucets really is sort of a landscape level analysis. And so it's ranking watersheds, but it does a great job at identifying where somebody might start thinking about doing a project like a payment for ecosystem services project related to water. And folks are doing that right now based on Forest to Faucets data in some of these partnerships. So yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, it's neat to see it, really visually represented on a map, these benefits that are flowing from these lands. We have one more question that I think has come into the chat. Who should landowners contact first for the temporary skidder bridge program?
Yeah, so this is from my standpoint, it's federal dollars that are being provided to states or tribes, and states can also appoint another organization if they want to, if they don't have the capacity to run a program. But it would be a state-run program. Maybe contacting your local soil and water conservation district office would be a good place to start. They should know whether a program like that exists in your state or not. But again, it really depends on where you live.
Okay, great. No, that's a good advice for where to at least start. We've got another question in the Q&A. Says, transpiration from forests affects groundwater level. When you clear cut, the water level might rise by a few feet. How does this connect to recharge of aquifers or deep groundwater?
Yes, so that's a very complicated question, and I don't know that I can honestly dig too much into the details. We see that effect a lot in glaciated areas where you have even maybe a perched groundwater table, that you see a lot more infiltration or a significant difference after doing that clear cutting. I will say that BMPs sometimes address this, and it's an important consideration. If you can, and you're harvesting in areas that are wet, it's important to have some sort of expert in hydrology thinking about that if you're concerned about forest conversion, because we do see that where wetland forests are cleared and never revert to or never come back to forest because of that groundwater table rise. But it can also affect a harvest sort of on an individual level. So in Minnesota, one of the forest management guidelines is to harvest the back of the sail first, because if you do see a little bit of additional water on the surface of the ground, you're not going to impact your sail if you're harvesting at the back first. You can continue to move that wood out. And again, you don't want to be impacting the ability for forest to regenerate, but if it's only going to impact your ability to operate, then just going to the back first and harvesting towards the front of the sail kind of allows you to sort of mitigate for that. But yeah, it's a really important point, and thanks for that question.
Yeah, that was good advice as well. Someone has popped into the chat an idea saying that the state forester office should also know if they are doing the bridge program in your state. And just to kind of wrap us up, Ryan, I have one last question for you, and that's sort of what's next for Forest to Faucets. We have 2.0. Is it going to be continued to be updated? What's going to happen next with this program?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for bringing it up. I forgot to mention, so we actually have funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law to update Forest to Faucets for the Eastern U.S. This, again, the product that we have now was put out in 2020, so some of the data sets are a little bit older. We want to update those data sets. But we also want to provide more management and decision-making tools within Forest to Faucets for folks to sort of use this as a management decision-making tool, and to look a little bit more closely at wildfire and prescribed fire and how those impact water resources on the landscape. So this is a work that is really just getting going. We began this calendar year, and at this point, we're sort of focusing on the fire portion of it and doing lit review, but we will be updating Forest to Faucets in the next few years.
Excellent. That is great to hear. On behalf of FLA and the foundation as well, I want to thank you, Ryan, for joining us today and really providing some great information for us to chew on and use as we move forward. And thank you to all of our attendees today as well. And thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ryan.